everyone hear me okay? Or are we having any problems at all? Okay, so I didn't hear anything to the contrary, so good. Thank you very much for attending this morning, and I'd like to give my apologies for the difficulties that we experienced at the last September 6th webinar. But on today's webinar, we will review the Phase 2 Work Plan Amendment application. We will talk about the application in its entirety, the requirements. And before I get started, I'd like to make introduction. I am Rosaria Roberts. I'm the Homeless Program Coordinator for the Northern Region in Oregon. And with me, we have Joy.
My name is Joy Aldrich, and I am the Office Assistant to the Housing Stabilization Division.
During this webinar, we're going to take time to listen to your concerns and comments, as well as any questions you might have, and answer all that I can. Those that I cannot, I will get the answers and send them out to you electronically. I will be the person facilitating the entire webinar. And I do want to hear from you, and I do want to hear any concerns that you may have. We will take a few minutes to identify the application submission requirements. We will look at the process timeline, and we will review the application in its entirety in detail. So if you have any questions with any of the information, please let us know. You can either speak to us directly, unmute yourself and speak to us, or either send in a typed comment and or question, and we will identify those comments and questions as they occur. So the first thing I'd like to call your attention to is the letter that was part of the attachments that you received to the Community Action Agency directors. I'd like to call your attention to the section, can you highlight it here? Prior to authorizing the allocation, we will require a summary of your accomplishments and outcomes from the allocation, the new one-time only EHA SHAP allocation that you received last biennium. That would be for the 16-17 fiscal year. So to reiterate, we need to have a summary of your accomplishments prior to approval of the 17-19 EHA SHAP allocation. So why don't we, are there any questions about that? Why don't we now take a few minutes to look at the EHA SHAP allocation timeline? And on the timeline, you'll see the process that CAPO and the network has taken to get us to the place on the webinar that is item number 5. And so this allocation process is going to be very different than the ones that have taken place in the past. Staff will review the applications and make recommendations. However, the recommendations will be forwarded to Marilyn Miller, and she will forward those recommendations to Claire. And Claire will take those recommendations to the Housing Stability Council, and they will be the body that will approve the 17-19 allocation, phase 2 allocation, which is very different than what has taken place in the past. Any questions on the allocation process? Okay. Everyone should have received a copy of the, do you have this, Joy? A copy of the funding grid. So you'll see we're working with the phase 2 allocation. So these are the dollars that need to be entered when you are submitting your budget information. You have admin, program, and total. And on the EHA budget, it's much more detailed than it has been in the past. That's because we are trying to capture everything that has been requested for us to capture from the legislature. So we are asking additional information in those sections. So these are the numbers that you should use. The phase $3 or phase 3 allocation has not yet been determined, and that will be decided with the network as well as CAPO. And please ask questions if you have any as we go along. So now we will look at the application itself. The first page gives you information, general information about how the worksheet needs to be completed. When you are going through the worksheet, I will advise to use your arrow keys because the tab key does not work properly. So it's best to use your down arrow key. When you see a yellow field, that particular field needs to be completed before you move on. And once you type information in the field, it should change to white. Do you want to scroll down, Joy? Any other questions? So the question is, what is the Housing Stability Council looking for in our phase 2 applications? What are the reasons an application may not be approved? I don't know what the reason may be that it will not be approved. I do know they are looking for measurable outcomes, tangible outcomes. So you will need to identify something that can be measured to make sure that you met that goal. So that's one of the reasons I know that they are reviewing these applications. And please let me know, Mandy, if that completely answers your question, and if not, please follow up with me. Okay, you're welcome. Underneath the general instructions, you will see the budget notes, and there are just a few items that you need to adhere to when you're doing the budget. Make sure that you allocate all of your administration and all of your program dollars in your budget. And in the budget with this spreadsheet, if you don't allocate 100% of the dollars that have been allocated to your agency, the cell will show up red. So can we go to grantee? So this information needs to be completed in entirety. So why don't we check like 4 things in here, Joy? Whatever you'd like to. Let's not do any of those. Okay. So we have emergency shelter, transitional homelessness, and homelessness prevention. Okay. And data collection. Okay. So we also need to have the number of unduplicated households to be served, and phase 1 households should not represent phase 2 households. So we would like unduplicated households served in each of these questions. So let's put in on administration. Why don't we put 10,000? And street outreach, let's put 2, and then we can give the rest to the subrecipients. Shelter, let's do 2, transitional housing 2, homeless prevention 2, and data collection 2. Oh, you have supportive in-home services.
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay.
Oh, emergency shelter, transitional homeless prevention, and data. Okay. There we go.
The areas that are yellow on your budget, if you do not have any dollar amounts, please type a 0 in there so that you'll get a dash. Okay, and let's put the balance. Okay. So it would be 27.
Too early.
So as you could tell, before she got to $100,000, that last line was red. So that'll help you determine whether or not your dollars are correct. Okay, can we go to the next tab? So in this tab, we're asking for your subrecipient identification. And with this tab, we only want the new subrecipients that will be using your phase 2 dollars. So if you have a subrecipient that will be using phase 2 dollars and the subrecipient was identified with your phase 1 application, that information does not have to be submitted. If you have a new subrecipient that's going to be contracted with for the phase 2 dollars, this is where you would include that information. But if you are using your same subrecipients to deliver your services for phase 2 as you did in phase 1, then there is no need to complete this information. The SHAP basically is your same format as your EHA. Please pay attention to the components because they are different. We have included the housing acquisition, the shelter acquisition and the shelter rehab to SHAP dollars. So that is an option, an eligible component that is for use at your discretion. We have the same questions asked for number of households served, and this should be separate from your phase 1 household served. And then the dollars, the budget is the same budget. And we made careful attention so that the items in the budget reflect the items in the EHA and or SHAP information. So one of the things that's really different with this application is that the housing facilities acquisition and the rehab conversion, both for EHA and SHAP, and the community capacity building components, all are separate and will need to be reviewed separately apart from the actual application. So once your application is reviewed, if you are electing to use the housing facilities acquisition or the rehab conversion or the community capacity building component, that has a completely separate approval process. So can we go to the housing facilities? EHA housing facilities acquisition application. With this, you will need to submit a budget and a work plan with this application, and your business plan will need to answer all of the identified questions. So in your business plan, You want to make sure that you describe your capacity to manage real property. We are requiring a 5-year operational budget, and that budget should show your revenues as well as your expenses. We want to know the availability of your property reserves, the anticipated number of units. We want to know whether or not tenants will be displaced as a result of this acquisition. We want to know the lender donor identification and if there's an installment note on the property, your insurance verification and what is the amount of that insured, what services will you be offering to the tenants, and what other organizations will be working with you. We'd like to know the anticipated tenant stay in your facility. We also are being asked to get a timeline for your acquisition and your placement of clients. We'd like to know if there's any conflict of interest with your acquiring the property. What is the exit strategy for disposal of the property? And what's the performance goals for your acquired shelter beds, including your utilization rate and the persons served. And we also require a signed commitment by the board chair and the CEO to acquire the property at a minimum of 20 years as a shelter. So we have a question. If we purchase an HMIS license for another local shelter to enable them to use Service Point through the data collection category, would we need to list them as a subrecipient? So I guess my question would be, there are two questions. One is the license or the capturing of data the only thing that the service provider is doing? Are they offering other services for the agency?
I'm going to unmute her.
And is there any funds that are being allocated to the subrecipient? So you've been unmuted, Mandy. So
okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So if I understand you, unless we're giving them other funds to provide other services, then they would be a subrecipient. But if we purchase the license through our agency and have one of their staff use it for data collection so that our HIC numbers and our ability to communicate is better within the county, then that would not be a subrecipient, correct?
The subrecipient would need to adhere, and that's a technical term, would need to adhere to all of the rules and regulations that the subgrantee adheres to for the use. So that's really, it's kind of technical, because I do know there are some of the agencies that have providers where they are not paying the providers any funds, but they are still subrecipients. But I believe it depends on whether or not they are administering any services for the subgrantee. I will check and confirm that.
Okay. They would not be administering services for us. It would just be to increase local participation in HMIS.
Okay. All right. So I'll check on that, Mandy, and get back to you. You're welcome. So the information that is requested under the Housing Facilities Acquisition for EHA is very similar to SHAP, with the variance in it cannot be housing, but it has to be shelter. And so you can see that reflected in the questions below. So let's go over to EHA, the rehab and conversion. For the rehab and conversion, we also are requiring you submit information to us, and that is before you can use any of the dollars for this component. And the business plan needs to include how the rehab or converted area will be used, what the work will be for the project. Are there other sources to pay for the rehab or conversion? Or are the OHCS funds the only funds that are being used? Does the agency own or will the agency own the converted building? Is there a legal notice in the lease for the agency to make the improvements? And what's the building being used for presently? Will the conversion increase the shelter capacity and or housing, and if so, by how much? What is the agency's financial and management capacity to rehab and manage the property? We also need verification that it's been sufficiently insured. We want a detailed budget that includes your revenues and expenses, as well as unexpected incidents. We need to know the timeline, and will you displace any tenants? The yellow area is provided for you to complete that information. However, if you need additional space, because there are only so many characters that can be maintained in this field, please contact us and let us know, and we'll send you a sheet with additional space. The last area is the community capacity building. And this is one of those components that is really varied, but we need to know some tangible improvements and some objectives that can be met with this component. We need a description, we need a measurable description of the performance outcomes. What's the purpose of your project? Will the project leverage other funds and sources? What's the outcome? Are you asking for increased clients served, additional beds, permanent housing units, expanded services, etc.? Are there other partnerships that are engaged in the project? And what method of evaluation is being used to evaluate the success of the project? And what community action agency staff are directly involved in this implementation? The next tab, sorry, please. We have several work plan general questions. And with these questions, we need to know, the first one, how you quantify your service area needs regarding the prevention and reduction of homelessness. So dependent on your community needs assessment, census data, homeless count, how do you quantify what is needed in your area and what is needed to prevent people from becoming homeless? We also want to know, what are the 5 top priorities that you have identified to address homeless trends and why? You might see trends that are forming that have not been identified. And so this is where we need to have that information captured. 3, how do your community partners currently plan to address the above mentioned top priorities? We want to know how you're working with other community partners in your area to identify and meet the unmet needs of people that are at risk of homelessness or homeless. 4, describe the additional engagement your agency will have with community stakeholders wanting to ensure the effectiveness and the efficient spending of the 719 funds. So we want to know, from your perspective, who will you be working with directly to increase and improve the delivery of services so that it can mitigate the number of people that become homeless. Number 5, describe how your agency will use the 1719 funds to implement your inclement weather strategy for harsh winters. And with this question, we also want to know during times when the weather is extremely harsh. And this summer, it's been some of the summers. You know, what does your agency have in place to make sure that people don't die of exposure, or that, you know, many people are not hospitalized because of exposure to outside elements? Number 6, in this unpredictable rental market, how will your agency use the funds to support families with children, survivors of domestic violence, seniors, and people with disabilities? We want to hear how you will use these funds to support these populations, specifically these high-risk populations and people that are extremely vulnerable. As you know, the governor has identified veterans as a special population for ending veterans homelessness. So we want to know how you will use your EHA and SHAP funds with other veteran funds and resources in your community to look at ending veterans homelessness, and what programs and steps do you have in place for identifying how you can end veterans homelessness. Number 8, what is your plan or strategy for increasing access to housing for the placement of persons in permanent housing? So each agency will be a little different in how they approach this, but I know the question is still undetermined about the use of OHCS funds and permanent housing, but we'd like to know what's your plan for increasing access to the placement of persons that really need the additional support for permanent housing. What is your 9 is what is your outreach plan to engage new and potential clients? We're asking you to identify for us what new strategies, not current strategies in place, but what is new, what is a result of new trends, what's a result of new demographic information or not reaching the people that have been not served. How are you going to change your outreach to engage new and potentially new clients? Number 10, do you plan to use EHA or SHAP funds for acquisition, conversion, or community capacity building? Simply identify yes or no, and if yes, we need you to complete the respective tabs, such as housing acquisition, housing or facilities acquisition, rehab conversion, or community capacity building. 11, do you ensure equitable service delivery to all clients, including historically underserved populations? So we'd like to know in your area what steps are in place to meet and to serve those populations that are not part of a dominant culture in that particular area. So how are you reaching out to the underserved population? So are there any questions that people have in regard to the questions identified in the application itself? No? The due date for this application is September 29th. There's not a lot of time, and we are aiming to have the applications reviewed 5 days before they are submitted to our managers, and so that would be the 12th of October. So if you have any questions at all, I know it's an accelerated process, please let us know or contact myself or Vicki Massey with any questions that you may have. Are there any questions on any of the information? Well, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate your listening, and let us know if there is something that we can do to assist with the process. Thank you. Goodbye.